On the subject of sincerity and truth, Henry David Thoreau commented, "Simple sincerity and truth are rare indeed." And historian Will Durant remarked, "There are few things in the world so unpopular as truth, and the backbone of men and states is a concatenation of romance." And John Adams, the second president of the United States, on the subject of truth and sincerity, said this, "Is it not strange and sad that simple integrity should have so many enemies?" This is the first in a series of programs I'm doing on what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, religion, and literature have said about sincerity and truth. Among the questions I'll be addressing are the following. Are sincerity and truth rare or commonplace? What are examples of garden variety insincerity? What are some possible common untruths told in the business world, education, and religion? Which is more likely to get people angry? Sincerity or insincerity? Truth or untruth? Jesus said, "The truth will make you free." What did he mean by that? Let me begin with some definitions. Sincerity is generally defined as honesty. Truth is generally defined as reality, the way things really are. So if one is telling the truth, one is in one way or another expressing the way things really are. Of course, good people, sincere people, can often disagree about what is true. Again, historian Will Durant provides some illumination. He put it this way, "Truth is seldom simple. Often it has a right hand and a left hand and moves on 2 feet." Now to the first question. Are sincerity and truth rare or commonplace? I'm confident that most of the famous thinkers in history would agree with M. Scott Peck, who said this, "Most people opt for lives of very limited honesty and openness and relative closeness, hiding themselves from the world." Actor Marlon Brando spoke about people's propensity for mask wearing. And here's what Brando said, "Acting is the least mysterious of crafts. Most people do it all day long." Well, why might people often be reluctant to be sincere? I think it's fair to say there are a variety of reasons. Sometimes people are motivated by evil reasons, evil factors, not to be sincere. But I think other times, fear is the motivation behind insincerity, or the reason behind insincerity. And in this context, the very famous journalist H.L. Mencken provides some help. He talked about truth seekers and truth tellers being unpopular. Here are H.L. Mencken's own words. "For the habitual truth teller and truth seeker, the world has very little liking. He is always unpopular, and at times his unpopularity is so excessive that it endangers his life." And what might be some historical examples of truth tellers, truth seekers, whose life was endangered by their truth telling, truth seeking? I think the outstanding example, perhaps, is Socrates. Perhaps you know that Socrates was sentenced to death by the government of Athens during antiquity. And why was Socrates Why was Socrates sentenced to death? Well, he was charged with, among other things, corrupting the youth of Athens. How so? What did he do? Well, Socrates went around asking young people, as well as other people, a lot of questions. Socrates was an inveterate questioner. Well, what's so bad about asking questions, you might ask? Well, the fact is, questioning can lead people to critical thinking. And it's in the selfish interest of some people that other people not think critically. Indeed, aren't there government officials in every country of the world who prefer that people not question and not think critically? Socrates was among the most undogmatic of men. Indeed, he was sentenced to death not because of anything he had professed, not because of any controversial opinions he had expressed, but simply because he went around Athens questioning people. And many of the people in the establishment in Athens didn't like the kinds of questions that he was asking. I suspect that there are people all over the world, in offices, schools, factories, governments, who are afraid to ask important questions. Many years ago, I taught young people the U.S. Constitution. And we spent a lot of time discussing the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, as you probably know, is an attempt to protect our right to freedom of expression, specifically our rights to freedom of speech and press. And one of the questions I asked my young students was this: what might be the greatest obstacle to people expressing their ideas? And so many of the students gave this comment, or made this comment. They said fear. Fear can be the greatest obstacle to people expressing what they really think, what they really believe. You recall, a little while ago, I mentioned that the famous journalist H.L. Mencken said that it can be dangerous to be a truth seeker and truth teller. Well, what might be some other examples of this besides the one I've already given concerning Socrates? Well, I think it's fair to say that political dissidents in dictatorial countries almost always find themselves in dangerous situations. For example, political dissidents in China who are trying to move the Chinese government to allow greater democracy, and also political dissidents under Saddam Hussein in Iraq suffered greatly, many of them killed because of their political opinions. I think it's also fair to say that government and corporate whistleblowers in all countries find it a dangerous existence to be a whistleblower. Perhaps the most famous whistleblower in recent U.S. history was Jeffrey Wigand, who worked in the tobacco industry as a researcher. And you might recall that Jeffrey Wigand blew the whistle on the industry in the sense that he revealed some of the things the industry knew about the harmful effects of cigarettes that for years they had denied knowing. And what happened to tobacco whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand? Well, he went from making $300,000 a year, again as a researcher for a prominent tobacco company, to a teacher making $30,000 a year. That's right, he was fired by the tobacco company he worked for because of his truth-telling. Isn't it true that whistleblowers in all countries, even democratic ones, are more likely to be punished than rewarded? Can you think of any U.S. president, Democrat or Republican, who has ever honored a government or corporate whistleblower at the White House? I can't. Do you think there may be politicians in both parties in the U.S. Congress who secretly dislike whistleblowers? When was the last time you heard a sermon by a priest, minister, or rabbi about whistleblowing, or in praise of a whistleblower. After all, whistleblowers are truth seekers, they're truth tellers, and in this sense, they are Christ-like, Buddha-like. Again, going back to the idea of truth-telling being a dangerous occupation for many people, another example would be the American civil rights activists in the 1950s and 1960s. And what was the truth that American civil rights activists were telling? Well, they claimed, correctly so, that the southern part of the United States was not a democracy for black people, that black people almost always were denied their voting rights, that the court system was stacked against black people, that so often white people were accused and even indicted of committing crimes against black people, and all white juries would find the white person innocent of having committed a crime against a black person when the evidence against the defendant was overwhelming. We also know that in the South, in the time of segregation, that there was job discrimination against black people. It's been said correctly that black people were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And also, we know the schools black children went to were far inferior to the schools that white children went to, that Southern governments generally spent far less money on the black schools than the white schools. It is interesting that many civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s, white activists and black activists, were killed for their truth-seeking, their truth-telling. Among the famous ones, Medgar Evers, Violet Liuzzo, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. Isn't it interesting that Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated nonviolence and who indeed used only nonviolent methods to seek truth and to promote truth and to change the system, was killed in a violent way? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous American essayist, who was an opponent of slavery in the 19th century, provides some illumination on this subject. Here's what Emerson said: "Human virtue demands her champions and martyrs, and the trial of persecution always proceeds." Emerson went on to praise an abolitionist, a newspaper editor who was an abolitionist in the South in the time before the Civil War, and who was killed because of his truth-seeking and truth-telling. You know, there have been some scientists in history. Indeed, more than a few scientists have gotten into trouble for truth-seeking. Perhaps the poster boy of such scientists is Galileo. You might recall in the 17th century, Galileo correctly said that the sun, not the earth, is the center of the universe. Galileo also contended, again correctly, that the earth revolves around the sun. Well, as you probably know, Galileo got into a lot of trouble with the Catholic Church. Indeed, the Catholic Church put Galileo under house arrest and later convicted him of heresy. Why so? Well, the Catholic Church contended that the Bible was very explicit on this subject, and that the Bible said that the earth does not move. And since the Bible said that the earth does not move, and Galileo contended the earth does move, well, it was the Bible, obviously, that was correct. So again, as I said, Galileo was convicted in the 17th century by the Catholic Church of heresy. I must tell you that 300 years later, the Catholic Church did apologize to Galileo and did claim that its interpretation of the Bible had been incorrect, and that Galileo was correct. The earth does revolve around the sun. It's also interesting in history that not only civil rights activists and scientists have gotten into trouble for truth-seeking and truth-telling, but also some very famous philosophers. Indeed, the French philosopher René Descartes, who lived in the 16th century, And the English philosopher John Locke, who lived in the 17th century, both fled their countries. Descartes fled France, Locke fled England, and they both went to the same country, Holland. Why so? Well, Descartes and Locke were convinced they might get into trouble for telling certain truths in the countries in which they lived. And at the time, in fact, for many centuries, Holland was the most liberal, the most tolerant country in all of Europe, so that many people who wanted to say what many people considered to be controversial often ended up in Holland because they felt they were more free there to say what they believed. And even today, of course, Holland has the reputation of being one of the most tolerant countries on the planet. Indeed, some people believe it's the most tolerant country on earth. It's been said, let's talk about Jesus, for example, in this context of truth seekers and truth tellers. Jesus, perhaps the most well-known truth seeker and truth tellers. It's been said that if Jesus were to return to earth today, he would be hated by many. Why so? Well, Jesus said many things that could make some people feel very uncomfortable, even angry. Allow me some examples. On the subject of money, in Mark 10, Jesus said the following: "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." In Matthew 6, he continues with the same theme. "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth." And in Luke 6, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." And you might recall in Matthew 19, a young man confronts Jesus and asks Jesus, "What must I do to achieve eternal life?" And Jesus, in short, told him you must do two things. First, keep the commandments. And secondly, sell your possessions and give the money to the poor. Of course, it's not just wealthy people that might find such speech unsettling, but also huge numbers of people in all countries of the world who wish to be rich. If Jesus returned to earth today in disguise, how would members of the U.S. Congress react? Would members of Congress, would at least some members of Congress, accuse Jesus of creating class warfare? Jesus, by all accounts, was a rather eccentric person. In fact, some people have described him as an oddball. And of course, Jesus talked about the dangers of being a conformist. Jesus talked about the dangers of wanting to be a popular person. In Luke 6, he said the following: "Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." He continues, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast your name out as evil. Your reward is great in heaven." Again, blessed are ye when men shall hate you. Your reward is great in heaven. Could Jesus been talking about? Could Jesus have been talking about people such as political dissidents and the whistleblowers of his day? Isn't it true that so many of us want so much to be liked by other people, especially people in power, that sometimes we go along with evil in offices, schools, factories, and even the governments of this world? Isn't it one of the most common sins, going along with evil, giving our tacit consent to evil? What do you think? Jesus said this about true prophets in Mark 6. "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and amongst their own kin and in their own houses." In other words, very good people who speak the truth may be very unpopular in their hometowns and even amongst their relatives. Jesus also reminds us that we are all sinners. Who wants to be reminded of that? You recall in John 8, a woman who was caught in the act of adultery is brought before Jesus, and the elders of the town asked Jesus what should be done to this woman. The traditional punishment for adultery was to stone the person to death. And most of us, I think, are quite familiar with Jesus' response. Jesus said this, "Let anyone among you who is without sin cast the first stone." Can you imagine politicians in America today, conservatives and liberals, when they're on the campaign trail, campaigning for office, occasionally beginning their speeches in the following way? You know, like everyone else in this audience, I'm a sinner. And can you imagine political talk show hosts such as Rush Limbaugh on the right and Al Franken on the left, beginning their shows in the following way? Welcome to the program. Today, before pontificating on abortion, capital punishment, the treatment of criminals, gay rights, unwed mothers, I wish to remind you that I, like everyone else, is a sinner. Can you imagine Jesus going on network TV and telling the nation, as he does in Luke 6, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned"? And if that's not enough, Jesus emphasizes forgiveness and how essential it is that we forgive others. In Matthew 6, he says, "If you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." You might recall St. Peter approached Jesus one day and asked Jesus, "How often shall I forgive somebody who has treated me unfairly? Shall I forgive the person 7 times? And here's Jesus' response. "How often should I forgive? As often as 7 times? No," Jesus said to him, "not 7 times, but 77 times. And of course, Jesus went on to talk about the importance of us loving our enemies. Do good to those who hate you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. How many Christians do you know who do good to those who hate them? If Jesus today, in disguise, ran for political office in the U.S. and said some of the things I've already quoted, how do you think he would do in running for political office, for national political office? And do you think Jesus would do better among Republican voters or Democratic voters? Again, what do you think? Also, do you think priests, ministers, and rabbis have to be very careful about which parts of the Bible they decide to quote? Can too much sincerity and truth alienate significant members of congregations? And might it be in the best interest of some priests, some ministers, and some rabbis to avoid quoting certain biblical selections? It's been said that the world can take only small doses of truth. Too much would kill it. What do you think? Sigmund Freud claimed all of us are liars. And he said that one of the most common forms lying takes is that we often lie to ourselves. We often hide truths about ourselves from ourselves. Freud, in talking about the unconscious, said this: most of the unconscious consists of repressed materials, specifically feelings and recollections, which we believe are best buried. Indeed, Freud said that in psychoanalysis, which was his way of treating very neurotic people. He said that one of the problems in psychoanalysis was getting people to see the truth about themselves and to tell the truth about themselves. He said that so often in the process of psychoanalysis, there was great resistance on the part of the patient to truth. What might be some examples of garden variety insincerity? Well, people pretending to be happier than they are, people pretending to be more virtuous than they are, people pretending to be, people pretending to have better marriages than they have, and people pretending to be more confident than they are. With regard to the idea of some people pretending to be happier than they are, I have a very interesting cartoon in front of me which I think illustrates the idea. In the cartoon, there are two people. One of them is an interviewer. He's taking a happiness poll. He wants to find out whether people are happy or not. And he's interviewing a gentleman, middle-aged man, and he asks this middle-aged man, are you happy? And the interviewee says this: I've never been happier, even though I'm graying, out of shape, balding, overweight, losing my sex appeal, stamina, and capacity, am short of my career and financial goals, and I've never felt more content and fulfilled. And in this cartoon, you see the back of the interviewer, and you see the data board he's writing on, and you see him writing down, he's lying, again indicating the interviewer is lying about the degree of happiness he is experiencing in life. I see that I only have a few minutes remaining, so I want to bring this to an end, and I'll have much more to say about this in my next program. I think both Jesus and Thoreau provide a good summing up. Jesus was well aware of the degree of insincerity, hypocrisy, and mask-wearing in the world. Jesus talked about people in sheep's clothing who are wolves. You recall he said this: beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. He went on to say, on the outside you look righteous, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And finally, Henry David Thoreau said this: man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity. And again, as usual, I'd like to finish up with another quote by Thoreau. In Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.